Big Shaq had always been proud of the many paths his life had taken. People knew him as a larger-than-life entertainer, someone who could light up a stage with his humor, music, and personality. But there was another side to him that people often forgot. Beyond the flashing lights, he had built businesses, real places where ordinary people could walk in, eat, laugh, and enjoy themselves. One of those businesses was his restaurant. To him, it wasn't just another spot on the street serving meals. It was meant to be a reflection of his values, respect, care, and community. He believed that good food should go hand in hand with kindness. When the restaurant first opened, Shaq made sure everyone on his team understood his vision. He told them clearly, this place should be more than just a restaurant. It should feel like home to anyone who walks in. The staff nodded, they smiled, and they promised to deliver. For years, Shaq believed they were doing exactly that. The numbers looked good. Customers kept coming. Social media was full of beautiful pictures of the food and glowing reviews from people who felt special just dining there. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But Shaq had lived long enough to know that not everything is what it seems. It started with small whispers. A friend of a friend mentioned that when they went in wearing simple clothes, they didn't feel welcome. Another person claimed that the staff sometimes judged guests by appearance. At first, Shaq brushed it off. In business, he knew you could never make everyone happy. There would always be one or two customers who left dissatisfied. But then the stories became harder to ignore. A young man said he had walked in after a long shift, dressed in worn jeans and a hoodie, and was treated as if he didn't belong. Another woman quietly shared that she had seen the staff rolling their eyes when an older man asked about the prices before ordering. Shaq began to worry. He knew how important image could be, but what mattered more than image was truth. If people were being treated differently just because of how they looked, that was not only unfair, it was against everything he stood for. He wanted his restaurant to be a place where kindness was the main dish, not judgment. One evening, as Shaq sat alone at home, he thought deeply about it. He could easily call the manager and demand answers. He could walk in during business hours and ask the staff directly. But he knew that the moment they saw him, everything would change. No waiter or host would ever dare show rudeness to him. They would all be on their best behavior, and the truth would hide itself behind fake smiles. Shaq needed to see what really happened when they thought no one important was watching. The idea came to him suddenly, almost like a spark. What if he became invisible in plain sight? Not invisible in the magical sense, but invisible in the way society often made people invisible: the homeless, the poor, the ones who blended into the background. If he walked into his restaurant looking like someone who had no money, no fame, and no influence, he could find out the truth. It wasn't an easy decision. He had a public image to protect, and he knew if someone recognized him, the story could explode in the media. But Shaq wasn't doing this for headlines. He was doing it because he wanted to know if his restaurant was living up to the promise he gave when it opened. The next morning, he began preparing his disguise. He picked out an old hoodie from the back of his closet, one that was faded and had loose threads on the sleeves. He found a pair of worn-out sneakers with scuffed sides that looked nothing like the stylish shoes he usually wore. He carried a rough backpack, the kind people might imagine belonged to someone carrying their life's belongings from place to place. To complete the look, he didn't shave, letting a little roughness grow around his face, and he walked with a slight slump, lowering his shoulders instead of standing tall as he usually did. When he looked at himself in the mirror, even he was surprised. The man staring back at him did not look like Big Shaq. He looked like someone the world might pass by without noticing. And that was exactly the point. As he stepped out of his house and made his way toward the restaurant, Shaq felt something unusual. For the first time in a long time, people weren't recognizing him. On the streets, passers-by glanced at him quickly and then looked away. Some even avoided making eye contact. He could already feel how different life was when people thought you had nothing. It was a lesson before the test had even begun. By the time he reached the restaurant, his heart was beating faster than usual. He wasn't nervous about being caught. He was nervous about what he might find. He wanted to believe his staff were kind, that they treated everyone with dignity. He wanted to believe the whispers were just exaggerations. But deep down, he feared he might discover something that would disappoint him. He stopped for a moment outside the restaurant. The glass windows sparkled. Inside, he could see neatly arranged tables, shining cutlery, and the gentle glow of lights that gave the place a warm and welcoming feel. Customers were laughing, enjoying meals, and chatting happily. On the outside, it looked perfect just as it always had. Shaq took a deep breath and walked toward the door. His steps were slower, his posture bent, his disguise fully in place. He reached for the handle and pulled the door open. The sound of soft background music drifted toward him, mixed with the clinking of plates and the chatter of guests. At that moment, he was no longer Big Shaq, the celebrity, or the businessman. He was just another stranger stepping into a restaurant. And in the next few minutes, he would find out if the place he had built truly welcomed everyone or if it only welcomed those who looked like they could afford it. He stood quietly at the entrance, waiting for someone to greet him. What happened next would stay in his memory forever. Shaq had barely taken 2 steps inside the restaurant when he noticed the difference. The moment the host at the front desk looked up, his eyes narrowed slightly, and his cheerful smile faded. It was subtle, but Shaq caught it. He had spent years performing in front of crowds, reading expressions, and sensing moods. He could tell in an instant that this welcome was colder than what most customers received. The host hesitated, glancing him up and down. His hoodie, worn shoes, and tired-looking backpack spoke louder than any words could. To the host, Shaq looked like someone who didn't belong in a fancy restaurant. Can I help you?" the host asked, his voice carrying a mixture of irritation and doubt. "Yes," Shaq said softly, keeping his disguise intact. "I'd like a table, please." The host looked past him, as if hoping another customer would walk in and rescue him from the uncomfortable request. Several empty tables were visible nearby, their surfaces already set with menus, silverware, and glasses of water. Yet the host shook his head. "I'm afraid we don't have any seats available at the moment," he said quickly. Shaq raised his eyebrows. He had deliberately chosen a quiet time of day, not the peak dinner hour. He knew there was no shortage of tables. But he played along, letting the scene unfold naturally. "Oh," he said calmly. "That's fine. I don't mind waiting." The host sighed, clearly frustrated. "It could be a long wait," he said, his tone almost discouraging him from staying. Shaq stayed silent, watching the host squirm. At that moment, a couple entered the restaurant behind him. They were dressed neatly, the man in a blazer, the woman in a floral dress. Immediately, the host's face brightened. "Good evening," he greeted warmly. "Do you have a reservation?" When they shook their heads, he smiled even wider. "Not a problem at all. We have a lovely table ready for you." Shaq's heart sank. He had just been told there were no available seats, yet within seconds, the couple was being guided to a table with a menu in hand. It was the confirmation he dreaded, but he needed to keep watching. "Excuse me," Shaq said gently, pointing toward another corner of the restaurant. "That table looks empty. Could I sit there?" The host gave him a sharp look, his patience wearing thin. "Fine," he muttered, grabbing a menu reluctantly. "But make it quick." His words carried no warmth, no respect, just a sense of annoyance, as if Shaq were an unwelcome burden. Shaq followed him quietly, his mind heavy with thoughts. This wasn't just about him. If they treated him this way, how many others had they treated the same? How many people had walked out of his restaurant feeling small, unwanted, or disrespected? When Shaq sat down, the host dropped the menu on the table without a word and walked away. He didn't even bother to make eye contact. Shaq watched him greet another group of customers who had just walked in, showering them with smiles and friendly words. The contrast was painful. Minutes passed, and no one came to his table. Waiters moved quickly around the restaurant, delivering food, taking orders, and chatting politely with well-dressed guests. But when they passed Shaq's table, they barely glanced at him. He raised his hand once, hoping to catch someone's attention, but a waiter looked away deliberately, pretending not to notice. Finally, after nearly 15 minutes, a young waiter approached him, holding a small notepad. He didn't greet him or introduce himself. Instead, he stood stiffly and said in a low voice, "What do you want?" Shaq forced a gentle smile. "Could I please get a glass of water first?" he asked. The waiter sighed as if the request was too much to handle. He walked away without a word, returning a few minutes later with a glass of water that he placed roughly on the table. Some of it spilled onto the surface, but the waiter didn't bother to wipe it clean. He simply walked off, leaving Shaq staring at the small puddle beside his glass. Across the room, Shaq saw another customer ask for water. The waiter brought it on a tray, carefully placing it in front of them with a napkin and a cheerful "Here you go, sir." The difference in service was undeniable. Shaq felt a mixture of sadness and anger. He wasn't upset for himself, he could handle disrespect, and he knew this was only a disguise. What hurt him was the realization that ordinary people, people who truly needed kindness, might be experiencing this every day in his restaurant. The place he had built to bring people joy was now making some people feel invisible. To blend in, Shaq pretended to study the menu, though he already knew it by heart. The dishes were written in neat fonts, with prices that weren't cheap but not impossible either. He imagined how a tired worker, someone saving money just to have one good meal, might feel being treated this way. It wasn't just about the food, it was about dignity. After a while, the same waiter returned, tapping his pen impatiently. "So? Are you going to order or not?" Shaq looked up, keeping his voice calm. "I'm still deciding," he said. The waiter rolled his eyes. "Well, hurry up. We're busy." He walked away again, leaving Shaq in silence. Shaq sat back in his chair, letting the experience sink in. He thought about all the times he had walked into this same restaurant as himself, Big Shaq. The staff had greeted him with wide smiles, rushing to his table, offering him the best seat in the house. They laughed at his jokes, treated him with honor, and made sure his glass was never empty. Now, the same man, dressed differently, was treated like he didn't deserve to be there at all. The sharp contrast cut deep. It wasn't just unfair, it was wrong. Shaq knew that fame and money shouldn't decide how someone was treated. Every customer, rich or poor, deserved the same respect. That was the rule he had lived by, and now it was being broken right under his nose. Around him, the restaurant buzzed with life. Families shared stories, couples leaned close to each other, and friends laughed over plates of food. But in his corner, Shaq felt the heavy weight of isolation. For the first time, he experienced what it meant to be unwelcome in his own space. As he took a sip of the water, now warm from sitting too long, he made up his mind. He would stay. He would see this through until the very end. He wanted to experience the full extent of how far the rudeness went, not just toward him, but toward anyone who didn't fit the image of a valuable customer. What Shaq didn't realize was that the worst was yet to come. The night was only beginning, and the behavior of his staff would reveal even more than he expected. Shaq sat quietly at his corner table, his disguise still convincing. The restaurant hummed with activity, and he had plenty of time to observe. From where he sat, he could see both the entrance and most of the dining floor. What he noticed over the next hour confirmed his worries and broke his heart more than he had expected. A family of 4 walked in, dressed neatly, the parents holding the hands of 2 young children. The host greeted them with a big smile, his tone cheerful and polite. "Good evening. Welcome, right this way." They were seated immediately at a clean, well-lit table. Menus were handed out with care, water glasses placed with precision, and within minutes a waiter was at their side, explaining the specials of the day. Shaq glanced at the empty space beside him. He had been sitting for nearly half an hour, and no one had even bothered to ask if he wanted to order. He still had only his single glass of water, half spilled on the table. It wasn't the lack of food that bothered him, it was the clear message that some people mattered more than others. A little later, a young couple came in, holding hands. They looked as if they were out on a date. They, too, were greeted warmly, seated with charm, and treated with the kind of attention that made them smile. Shaq saw the waiter lean forward, laughing at something they said, and taking their order with enthusiasm. He noticed how water was refilled quickly, napkins were placed carefully, and the tone of voice was soft and respectful. Then, something else caught Shaq's attention. An older man walked into the restaurant. His clothes were simple, a plain shirt tucked into trousers, worn shoes, and a tired look on his face. He looked like someone who had finished a long day of work. The host glanced at him, and almost instantly, the warmth vanished. "Do you have a reservation?" he asked stiffly. The man shook his head. "No, I was hoping to just sit down for a quick meal." The host frowned. "We're quite full tonight," he said, though Shaq could see several empty tables. The older man looked disappointed but asked if he could wait. The host sighed loudly and said, "You can sit there," pointing to a small table near the door, far away from the cozy corners where other guests were seated. The man nodded quietly and walked over, settling into the chair without complaint. Shaq felt a pang in his chest. He recognized the same coldness he had experienced when he walked in. That moment confirmed it, the staff weren't just rude to him because of his disguise. They had built a habit of judging people by appearances, by the clothes they wore, by how rich they looked. It was no accident. It was a pattern. As Shaq sat back, the waiter finally returned to his table. "Are you ready now?" he asked, his voice clipped and impatient. "Yes," Shaq said calmly. "I'll take something simple." "Just the soup, please." The waiter scribbled quickly without a word and walked away. Shaq watched him stop at another table nearby, where a group of young professionals were sitting in suits. To them, the same waiter offered a big smile and detailed descriptions of the specials, even recommending wine pairings. The difference was almost unbelievable. A few minutes later, Shaq's soup arrived. The bowl was placed in front of him carelessly, nearly spilling. There was no bread on the side, no napkin offered, no question like "Can I get you anything else?" Just a bowl dropped onto the table, followed by the waiter walking away without looking back. Shaq glanced again at the other customers. Their dishes were brought with style, plates arranged neatly, and every detail double-checked. Shaq lifted his spoon slowly, tasting the soup. It was warm and well made, but in that moment, the taste hardly mattered. What filled his mind wasn't the flavor of the food, but the bitterness of the treatment. He had wanted to believe his restaurant was a place of fairness. Now, every passing minute showed him the painful truth. The older man who had been seated near the door finally got the waiter's attention. "Excuse me," he said kindly. "Could I get some water, please?" The waiter didn't even hide his irritation. He walked over, dropped a glass in front of the man without a word, and walked away. Shaq noticed the man lower his eyes, as if he had been made to feel ashamed for asking for something so simple. It wasn't anger on the man's face, it was quiet acceptance, as if he was used to being treated this way. Shaq's heart sank deeper. He thought about how many people like that man had walked into his restaurant, hoping for a moment of dignity, only to be treated like second-class citizens. It wasn't just wrong, it was heartbreaking. As he ate slowly, Shaq continued to watch. The pattern repeated again and again. Guests in expensive clothes received smiles, polite voices, and quick service. Guests who looked ordinary or tired were brushed aside, ignored, or served reluctantly. The contrast was impossible to miss. At one point, Shaq caught the host whispering to a waiter, nodding in his direction. The waiter glanced at him and smirked, shaking his head slightly, as if to say, "Why is he even here?" Shaq kept his face calm, but inside, he felt a storm building. He had worked too hard in his life to allow disrespect in a place that carried his name. He knew what it felt like to come from nothing. He knew the pain of being judged by appearances. That was why he had always wanted his restaurant to be a place of welcome. But what he was seeing tonight told him that the heart of his vision had been lost somewhere along the way. When the soup was finished, Shaq put down his spoon quietly and folded his hands. Around him, the restaurant buzzed with laughter and conversation. For everyone else, it was just another pleasant evening. But for Shaq, it was a turning point. He had seen enough to understand the truth. He was no longer just testing his staff. He was bearing witness to something deeper, a culture of disrespect that had grown in his absence. And now, he was determined to face it. Little did the staff know, the man they had dismissed, the man they had looked down on, was the very person who had given them their jobs. And soon, they would find out. Shaq had been patient long enough. The soup bowl in front of him was empty now, but what filled his chest wasn't satisfaction, it was fire. The way the staff had treated him, the way they had treated the older man near the door, the way they separated customers into categories as if kindness depended on clothes, was too much to ignore. For nearly 2 hours, he had watched, listened, and taken mental notes. Now, it was time to end the act. He sat back in his chair for a moment, taking a deep breath. He reminded himself to stay calm. Anger could easily lead to harsh words, and harsh words often closed ears. But he didn't want revenge. He wanted to teach, to wake them up. He wanted them to understand the depth of what they had done, not just to him, but to anyone who had ever felt small walking through those doors. Slowly, he pushed his chair back and stood up. The scrape of the wooden legs against the floor caught the attention of the nearest waiter. The waiter glanced over, expecting perhaps a complaint, and walked toward him with the same impatient look he had worn all evening. "Yes? What is it now?" he asked flatly. Shaq didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached up, lowered the hood of his faded sweatshirt, and pulled it back off his head. Then he straightened his posture. The slouched, invisible man was gone. In his place stood the tall, commanding figure that millions of people knew instantly. The waiter's eyes widened. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Shaq looked him straight in the eyes. "So this," Shaq said, his deep voice echoing across the dining room, "is how you treat people who don't look rich enough." The room went silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks hovered in the air. Glasses were set down carefully as customers turned to see what was happening. In a matter of seconds, everyone in the restaurant realized that the man in the corner wasn't a stranger at all. It was Big Shaq. The host at the entrance froze, his face draining of color. The waiter who had dropped the soup on Shaq's table suddenly looked as if he wanted to disappear. The older man near the door sat in stunned silence, watching it all unfold, unsure if what he was seeing was real. Shaq didn't raise his voice in anger. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded attention. "I came in here tonight to see how this place really works when I'm not around," he said, looking slowly from one staff member to the next. "I came in dressed like an ordinary man. I didn't ask for special treatment. All I wanted was respect." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. "But what I got," he continued, "was coldness. What I got was being ignored, lied to, and brushed aside. You said there were no tables when the room was half empty. You slammed water glasses on my table as if serving me was beneath you. And when I asked for something as simple as soup, you made me feel like I was a burden." The staff shifted nervously, their eyes darting around, but no one spoke. The customers, on the other hand, leaned forward, captivated. They had never seen anything like this, a famous man exposing the truth of his own restaurant, standing up for dignity in real time. Shaq turned his gaze toward the host. You treated me like I didn't belong here. But this place exists because of me. And more importantly, it exists for people like me, people who want a meal, a safe place, and a little kindness. Not everyone will walk through that door in fancy clothes. Not everyone will come in looking like they can afford the most expensive dish. But everyone deserves the same respect. The host opened his mouth to stammer an apology, but Shaq raised his hand gently to stop him. Don't say sorry to me. Say sorry to every person who ever walked out of here feeling invisible. Say sorry to that gentleman by the door, who was given the worst table in the house for no reason except his clothes. He pointed toward the older man, who blinked in surprise. All eyes turned to him. The man shifted uncomfortably, not used to being the center of attention. Shaq nodded at him with kindness. He deserves better. Everyone deserves better. The waiter who had served Shaq looked down at the floor, shame written across his face. He muttered a quiet "I'm sorry," but Shaq didn't let it pass so easily. An apology is only real if it changes behavior, he said firmly. What I want from you isn't just words. I want you to understand. Tonight wasn't about me. I can afford to eat anywhere. But there are people who save up their money just to have one nice meal. And when they come here, the last thing they should feel is shame. The silence in the room was so deep you could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause began. It started with a young woman sitting at a nearby table, who clapped softly, then louder. Soon, another table joined in. Within moments, the entire restaurant was filled with the sound of clapping. Customers were nodding, smiling, showing their support for what Shaq had said. Some even stood up, cheering quietly. That's right, one man said firmly. Respect is for everyone. Shaq allowed the moment to breathe. He didn't smile. He didn't bask in the recognition. Instead, he looked back at his staff, their faces pale and uncomfortable. This isn't the end, he said. Tomorrow morning, we're going to have a meeting. And things will change. If this place is going to carry my name, it will represent who I am. And who I am doesn't stand for disrespect. With that, he turned slightly and walked over to the older man's table. He extended his hand warmly. Sir, thank you for being here tonight, Shaq said gently. The man hesitated, then reached out and shook his hand, a smile breaking across his tired face. You shouldn't have been treated that way, Shaq continued. Next time you come in, you'll see the difference. That's a promise. The man's eyes glistened as he nodded. Thank you, he whispered. Shaq straightened up again and addressed the whole room. I want everyone here to know this restaurant is supposed to be a place where kindness is the first thing served. Hold us accountable. If you ever see anything different, let us know. Because food fills the stomach, but respect fills the heart. The applause grew louder, this time not just polite claps but real appreciation. Customers stood up, some recording on their phones, others just smiling, grateful to witness a moment that felt bigger than a restaurant. The staff, meanwhile, stood quietly, shaken but thoughtful. They had been caught, but more importantly, they had been given a chance to change. Shaq had revealed the truth without shouting, without anger, but with the kind of authority that came from lived experience and a deep sense of justice. As he left the restaurant that night, Shaq knew the hardest work was still ahead. But he also knew he had done the right thing. He hadn't just revealed himself to his staff, he had revealed the heart of the problem. And by doing so, he had taken the first step toward making things right. The following morning, the atmosphere inside the restaurant was completely different. The staff arrived quietly, some avoiding eye contact with each other, some whispering nervously. Word had spread fast. What had happened the night before wasn't just a private lesson. Customers had filmed it, shared it, and by morning, the videos were already circulating online. Social media was buzzing with clips of Big Shaq standing in the middle of his own restaurant, revealing how he had been treated while disguised as a homeless man. The comments were flooding in, admiration for him, disappointment in the staff, and support for the message he had delivered. But inside the restaurant, the focus wasn't on the internet, it was on the meeting that Shaq had called. Everyone knew it was coming. They had seen his face the night before, they had heard his words, and they knew today was the day he would decide what happened next. Shaq entered the room quietly, no disguise this time, just himself. He carried no anger in his expression, but his presence carried a weight that made everyone sit straighter. He looked around the room, meeting their eyes one by one. Some shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, others lowered their heads. "Good morning," Shaq began, his deep voice calm but firm. "I want to talk about what happened last night. I want to talk about the truth." The staff stayed silent, waiting. Shaq clasped his hands in front of him. "This restaurant is not just about food. It's about people. And last night, I saw with my own eyes how some of you treated people, treating them differently depending on what they wore, how much money you thought they had, or how important you thought they were. That's not service. That's judgment. And I won't allow it." One of the waiters shifted nervously. The host at the front desk looked as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. Shaq continued. "When I came in last night, disguised as a man with nothing, I wasn't greeted with kindness. I was lied to, pushed aside, and treated like I didn't belong. But here's the truth: this place is meant to belong to everyone. A good restaurant isn't just for the rich. It's for the tired worker who saves up for one meal, it's for the family who comes to celebrate, it's for the person who just wants to feel welcome. If they leave here feeling invisible, then we've failed." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I don't want apologies. I don't need excuses. What I want is change." Finally, the host spoke up, his voice shaky. "We didn't mean, we just thought." Shaq raised his hand gently, cutting him off. "That's the problem. You thought. You assumed. You decided who deserved respect and who didn't. But respect is not a choice. Respect is a rule. It's not something you give only to people who look like they can tip big. It's something you give to everyone, no matter what." The staff nodded quietly. Some faces showed guilt, some showed understanding, and a few looked almost relieved to finally have the truth spoken out loud. Shaq took a step forward. "Here's what's going to happen. From today, we will have new training. Not just on service, but on values. You will learn that every guest who walks through those doors deserves the same smile, the same attention, the same kindness. Whether they're wearing a suit or a hoodie, whether they order the most expensive dish or just a cup of soup, they will be treated with dignity." He pointed gently toward the door. "I'm also setting up a mystery guest program. That means, from now on, people will come here without you knowing they work for me. They might look rich, or they might look poor. They might look like they belong, or they might not. And they will report back to me on how they were treated. This isn't to trap you. It's to remind you that kindness is not optional, it's required." The room was silent, but the tension began to shift. The staff could see he wasn't here to fire everyone on the spot or to embarrass them further. He was here to rebuild something that had been broken. One of the waitresses raised her hand timidly. I understand now," she said softly. "Last night, when I saw how we treated you, it made me think. We've gotten used to looking at people and judging quickly. Maybe we didn't even realize how wrong it was until you showed us. Thank you for giving us another chance." Shaq nodded slowly. "That's what I wanted to hear. It's not about blame, it's about awareness. Once you see the problem, you can fix it. But if you ignore it, it only grows." He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I grew up knowing what it felt like to be judged. I know what it's like to walk into a place and feel like you don't belong. That's why I wanted this restaurant to be different. Last night reminded me that even good intentions can be lost if we don't protect them every single day. So now, we protect them together." The staff nodded, some wiping their eyes quietly. The weight of his words settled into them, not as a scolding, but as a wake-up call. By the afternoon, things began to shift. The staff gathered for their first training session, not just about service techniques, but about empathy. They were taught to greet every person with the same warmth, to listen with patience, and to serve with pride. The story of Shaq's undercover visit became an example, a reminder that appearances can deceive, and that every person carries dignity, whether it shows on the outside or not. News outlets picked up the story, and soon the restaurant was on the front pages. But instead of scandal, the headlines celebrated Shaq's courage to hold his own business accountable. Customers shared their admiration, saying they trusted the restaurant more now, knowing that change was being made. And true enough, in the weeks that followed, regulars began to notice the difference. Guests who once felt overlooked were now welcomed with open smiles. Water glasses were filled without delay, menus were offered with kindness, and every person, no matter how they looked, was treated with equal care. The older man who had been seated by the door that night came back, this time greeted with respect and seated in a comfortable spot. His smile that evening said more than any words could. Shaq often returned quietly, sometimes as himself, sometimes still in disguise, but each time, he left feeling reassured. The lesson had been learned. His restaurant wasn't just known for good food anymore, it became known for its heart. And for Shaq, that was the greatest victory. Because in the end, success wasn't measured by full tables or profit margins. Success was measured in kindness, in the small moments when people walked out the door feeling valued. His restaurant had rediscovered its soul. And from that day forward, it stood as a place where no one was invisible, where respect wasn't earned by wealth, but given freely like the simplest, most important dish on the menu.